Hey there, Shiloh Community Church. It's Pastor Jared here, and I'm coming to you from the church office and bringing this Bible study. I'm excited for this Old Testament Bible study series. We're just going to be basically taking these kind of bird's eye views of each of the books and go through week by week just to get a big breadth of the story of the Bible, what it tells us, and what we can take away from it. So we're going to get started today with Genesis. Now, if you missed last week, we've got the videos on our YouTube page. They're under the playlist Bible Studies, and so you can find them there. I'm going to be posting them every other week. And so for Genesis is such an important book for us because it establishes kind of God as the creator of all things. It sets up the story of God, of his people, of the ultimate purpose really for all of humanity. So there are these repeating ideas and themes, recurring images and symbols. Genesis basically says that God creates a good world where life can flourish. And then it describes both spirit beings and human beings that contribute to these broken relationships, violent conflicts, and death by choosing to define good and bad for themselves, apart from God. And this whole kind of theme that just repeats itself over and over and over. These themes of light and darkness, life and death, violence and goodness, they're repeated. Not only in Genesis, but throughout the Bible, which is why Genesis as a foundation to this whole biblical story is so important for us. In Genesis 3, for example, we get a subtle foreshadowing about God's kind of renewal of everything. Through a powerful being, eventually, who's going to be sent to make the world right. So for our purposes, though, we're going to break Genesis into two parts, 1 through 11 and 15 through 20. So just a general breakdown of Genesis and what it's going to look like. Genesis 1 and 2, basically God makes a good world for humanity. Genesis 3 through 11 is how human sin and the ruin of God's world happens. And then in a couple weeks, we're going to take a look at the rest of it. So 12 through 25 is basically Abraham, 26 through 27 is Isaac, 28 through 36 is Jacob, and 37 through 50 is Joseph. Today, however, we're going to be looking at Genesis 1 through 11. And we're going to look at 5 kind of key takeaways. And I'm going to have some time in here for discussion, some time to breathe a little bit and talk. But we're going to start with our video. So here it is.
First book of the Bible, and its storyline divides into two main parts. There's chapters 1 through 11, which tell the story of God and the whole world. And then there's chapters 12 through 50, which zoom in and tell the story of God and just one man, Abraham, and then his family. And these two parts are connected by a hinge story at the beginning of chapter 12. And this design, it gives us a clue to how to understand the message of the book as a whole and how it introduces the story of the whole Bible. So the book begins with God taking the disorder and the darkness described in the second sentence of the Bible, and God brings out of it order and beauty and goodness. He makes a world where life can flourish. And God makes these creatures called humans, or Adam in Hebrew. He makes them in his image, which has to do with their role and purpose in God's world. So the humans are made to be reflections of God's character out into the world. And they're appointed as God's representatives to rule his world on his behalf, which in context means to harness all of its potential, to care for it, and make it a place where even more life can flourish. God blesses the humans. It's a key word in this book. And he gives them a garden. It's like a place from which they begin starting to build this new world. Now, the key is that the humans have a choice about how they're going to go about building this world, and that's represented by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Up till now, God has provided and defined what is good and what is not good. But now God is giving the humans the dignity and the freedom of a choice. Are they going to trust God's definition of good and evil, or are they going to seize autonomy and define good and evil for themselves? And the stakes are really high. To rebel against God is to embrace death, because you're turning away from the giver of life himself. This is represented by the tree of life. And so in chapter 3, a mysterious figure, a snake, enters into the story. The snake's given no introduction other than it's a creature that God made. And it becomes clear that it's a creature in rebellion against God, and it wants to lead the humans into rebellion and their death. The snake tells a different story about the tree and the choice. It says that seizing the knowledge of good and evil are not going to bring death, that it's actually the way to life and becoming like God themselves. Now, the irony of this is tragic because we know the humans, they're already like God. They were made to reflect God's image. But instead of trusting God, the humans seize autonomy, they take the knowledge of good and evil for themselves, and in an instant, the whole story spirals out of control. The first casualty is human relationships. The man and the woman, they suddenly realize how vulnerable they are. Now, they can't even trust each other. And so they make clothes and they hide their bodies from one another. The second casualty is that intimacy between God and the humans is lost. So they go and run and hide from God, and then when God finds them, they start this game of blame shifting about who rebelled first. Now, right here, the story stops, and there's a series of short poems where God declares to the snake and then to the humans the tragic consequences of their actions. God first tells the snake that despite its apparent victory, it is destined for defeat, to eat dust. God promises that one day a seed or a descendant will come from the woman who's going to deliver a lethal strike to the snake's head, which sounds like great news, but this victory is going to come with a cost because the snake too will deliver a lethal strike to the descendant's heel as it's being crushed. It's a very mysterious promise of this wounded victor. But in the flow of the story so far, you see this is an act of God's grace. The humans, they've just rebelled, and what does God do? He promises to rescue them. But this doesn't erase the consequences of the humans' decision. So God informs them that now every aspect of their life together, at home and out in the field, it's going to be fraught with grief and pain because of the rebellion, all leading to their death. From here, the story then spirals downward. Chapters 3 through 11, they trace the widening ripple effect of the rebellion and of human relationships fracturing at every level. So there's a story about two brothers, Cain and Abel. Cain's so jealous of his brother that he wants to murder him. And God warns him not to give in to the temptation, but he does anyway. He murders him in the field. So Cain then goes on to build a city where violence and oppression reign. And this is all epitomized in the story of Lamech. He's the first man in the Bible to have more than one wife. He's accumulating them like property. And then he goes on to sing a short song about how he's more violent and vengeful than Cain ever was. After this, we get an odd story about the sons of God, which could refer to evil angelic beings, or it could refer to ancient kings who claimed that they descended from the gods. And like Lamech, they acquire as many wives as they wanted, and they produce the Nephilim, these great warriors of old. Whichever view is right, the point is that humans are building kingdoms that fill God's world with violence and even more corruption. In response, we're told that God is broken with grief. Humanity is ruining his good world, and they're ruining each other. And so out of a passion to protect the goodness of his world, he washes it clean of humanity's evil with a great flood. But he protects one blameless human, Noah, and his family, and he commissions him as a new Adam. He repeats the divine blessing and commissions him to go out into the world. And so our hopes are really high, but then Noah fails too, and also in a garden. He goes and he plants a vineyard, and he gets drunk out of his mind. And then one of his sons, Ham, does something shameful to his father in the tent. And so here we have our new Adam, naked and ashamed, just like the first. And the downward spiral begins again. It all leads to the foundation of the city of Babylon. The people of ancient Mesopotamia, they come together around this new technology they have, the brick. And they can make cities and towers bigger and faster than anybody's ever done before. And they want to build a new kind of tower that will reach up to the gods, and they will make a great name for themselves. It's an image of human rebellion and arrogance. It's the garden rebellion now writ large. And so God humbles their pride and scatters them. Now, this is a diverse group of stories, but you can see they're all exploring the same basic point. God keeps giving humans the chance to do the right thing with his world, and humans keep ruining it. These stories are making a claim that we live in a good world that we have turned bad, that we've all chosen to define good and evil for ourselves, and so we all contribute to this world of broken relationships, leading to conflict and violence and ultimately death. But there's hope. God promised that one day a descendant would come, the wounded victor who will defeat evil at its source. And so despite humanity's evil, God is determined to bless and rescue his world. And so the big question, of course, is what is God going to do? And the next story, The Hinge, offers the answer. But for now, that's what Genesis 1 through 11 is all about.
All right, so I hope you enjoyed that little video. We'll go back to that as we go through the study. The very first thing we're going to look at, though, here in Genesis 1 through 11, the first kind of key takeaway here is that Genesis basically is that God creates order and beauty from chaos and darkness. That's one of the big takeaways here, is that whole first panel there in the cartoon, that out of this disorder and darkness, God creates this order and beauty. And that's literally the literary ordering of Genesis 1. Genesis 1 depicts God as kind of creating this very ordered environments in days 1 through 3, and then filling those environments with the corresponding inhabitants in days 4 through 6. It's kind of this mirroring of imagery here. So in verses 3 through 5, God creates light or day. And then in verses 6 through 8, he creates this dome, ceiling, sky. And so we have light and day, sky. And then in verses 9 through 10, in verses 6 through 7, he also creates the seas. And so we have this kind of duality of sky and sea. And then in verses 9 through 10, he creates dry land. And then in 11 through 12, vegetation. So we have those on this side. And then on the other side, we get the inhabitants of those things. And so in verses 14 through 19, the day from the beginning is mirrored by creating the lights. We basically have light to inhabit the day and night. And then in verses 20 through 23, just as we had the inhabitants, the environments of the dome and ceiling, the sky and the seas, we have the birds in the sky, and we have the fish in the seas. And then finally, in verses 24 through 25 and 26 through 31, as the land is the environment, prior, we have now the land animals, and then finally humans. And then we have the seventh day where God rests. Kind of the big takeaway of creation. Beautiful kind of mirrored imagery going on there. The second big takeaway from Genesis here is that human beings, ultimately, we are the divine image bearers of God. They talked about this a little bit there, that we are made in God's image. And I really love the point that they bring out here about the kind of tragic way that the snake tricks the human beings by saying, you could be like God when they're already like God. They're created in God's image. And it's really very, very tragic to think about. The Hebrew word here for image, though, this is really fun, literally means statue. The word is salem. And it usually refers to idols. We see this word in Amos and Ezekiel and Numbers and 1 Samuel. Image is a physical representation that points to some other person or deity. So these statues, these salem, used throughout Scripture, were meant to be representatives of whatever deity it was that they embodied. And so they were often used to say that deity was not only worshipped there in that place, but it was as if the deity was guarding over, looking over the space. The statue was there on behalf of the deity. Now this, to me, is an amazing way to look and to think about us being made in God's divine image. In Genesis, this means that humans we're commissioned. We're like a commissioned art piece, like statues. We're commissioned as actual representatives, images, statues, salem, of God's rule over creation. We are made to steward and guard, like those totems, those statues are made to steward and guard over God's good world on his behalf. We're going to take a minute and read Genesis 1, 26 through 31, and then I'm going to have a bit of time for some discussion here. 26 through 31. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image and our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. And then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit and seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. So, now, a bit of discussion. We've seen this part. We've got to hear this part. One of the interesting things I remember at seminary, we read a book that said that the real Hebrew meanings of the words to subdue it, to rule over, was actually to come alongside, to rule with, along with. And so that whole, to rule over the fish in the sea wasn't really as much as like a thumb, like ruling over, but to come alongside and to be with, to live with, to learn, to live amongst. And it's kind of a cool way to look at it. But my question, I'm getting far away from it, a bit of discussion. So now we're going to have this time here to take a minute. I'm going to ask you to hit pause. If you're in a group, take some time to discuss amongst yourselves. If you're by yourself at home, if you're watching this, take some time to journal. I want to encourage you during this study, keep a journal for each of the books so you can go back and you can look at it later. But take some time to do this. Think about this question. What does it mean for humanity to be created in the image of God? What do you think about this whole idea of the image of God being a statue, being a representative? What jumps out at you differently in the scripture that we just read? And now that we've kind of talked about this, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? What does that mean for you, for us, for the world? Take a minute, pause, and go over this. Then we'll continue. All right, the third big idea here in Genesis 1 through 11. Human selfishness and sin ultimately lead to the fracturing of this divine-human relationship, the ruin of human relationship on all levels. The video talked about this, but all the stories in Genesis 3 through 11 offer different examples that explore these various facets of human sin and the results of that sin. So, for example, chapters 3 and 11. Basically, we have the suspicion of God's goodness brought up by the snake. We have this kind of self-deception. And then we have a quest for wisdom and goodness apart from God. And then we have jealousy and murder. We have humans establish cities which are corrupted by sin and by violence. And in Genesis chapter 6, we have spiritual beings, the sons of God that defy God's good order. And humans become morally corrupt and ruins God's world and ruin each other. And then Genesis 11, we have this kind of human arrogance, this declaration of independence from God, and then this naive trust in technological progress. You see these repeating patterns over and over and over again. In all of these instances, sin is basically instigated by the humans. It's a choice that we make over and over, going all the way back to that initial choice in the garden. Wanting wisdom apart from God, wanting power, wanting something more than what God has already given us. This implication there being that God couldn't fully be trusted. We know better than God knows. This leads us to another discussion moment. Why do you suppose God created a choice for the human beings by planting the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the first place? Why plant the tree? Who decided to put that tree there? Why do you think God did that? Let's take a moment to pause and reflect on that question. All right, if we come back from that, the fourth idea, big idea in Genesis, Yahweh, God, responds to human sin then. We keep doing this over and over and over again. He responds in two ways. First, he brings justice on the rebellion, and then he offers grace by promising a future blessing for the world. Now, we talked about the narrative patterns before. We see this narrative pattern at work again in all of those chapters. So chapters 1 through 3. We have the rebellion. The land is cursed as a result, but then we have this promise of a redeemer. That was that snake bite on the heel. We have someone that's going to come and eventually going to redeem, the wounded redeemer. We'll get to that another time. In Genesis 4 through 5, we have murder, Cain and Abel. There's a societal breakdown. There's death and suffering. But then we also have Enoch and Noah. Genesis 6 through 8, the land is completely corrupted. So we have the flood. And then we have a covenant with creation. God will never again destroy the earth with a flood. So, another question as we break in here about the flood. Why did God decide to flood the earth? Why not just promise something or someone in the future? Why not just put a leader back in? I mean, Noah did get to lead, but why? Why flood the earth? Curious for your thoughts on this one. Discuss, pause, and come back. All right, and then we have one more example here in Genesis 9 through 11, the Tower of Babylon, Tower of Babel. We have that whole thing happening, going on, this pride, this arrogance of people that they could reach the heavens, that they could be like God, and then we have God scattering them. And then we have God giving a blessing to all of the nations. One more pause on this one, too. What was the sin for the people at Babel? Why did God scatter them and confuse their language? Pause and discuss this one and come back. All right, we got the fifth and final takeaway from Genesis 1 through 11. Yahweh basically initiates this plan to rescue humanity through a covenant with the family of Abraham. In the video, that was that the ring they're going to get to. Spoiler alert, we'll get to it next week too. But this gets us started. Basically, this whole covenant thing kicks off in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. It's a key moment. It's the unfolding of the biblical story. God responds to all of this corruption, all of this stuff that's been happening by choosing Abraham's family as the means to restoring the divine blessing to all nations. By the way, Abraham, often one and the same. They transition. So we'll get there too. One final pause for discussion before we wrap up the session on Genesis 1 through 11. Here's the question. What happens when humans attempt to define good and evil independently of God? How does sin manifest itself through these first 11 chapters of Genesis? And one of my curiosities with this too is, do we still do this? Do we still decide what's good and what's bad apart from God, even though we have clear instruction? Is the instruction always clear? I'm curious. Do we still do this? Define good and evil for one another, independent of God, and thus manifest sin in the world? Discuss this, pause, and come back. All right, Joel, I hope you've had fun with this study. I tried to keep the video a little more streamlined this time and give some more opportunity to talk and to discuss. As always, I'm glad to hear some feedback on these. I'm really having fun with this. I hope you are too. Next week, if you want to read ahead, Genesis 12 through 50. I know it's a doozy, but these are some familiar stories, but might help you to go ahead and read it. You got 2 weeks to do it. We'll come back here in 2 weeks and do Genesis 12 through 50. I look forward to seeing you then. Merry Christmas. See y'all.